All right, so we're going to talk about testing APIs today. I realize, like, preparing for this lecture, I have enough stuff to present, but I realize that talking about Postman, I just don't have a lot to say about it. It's pretty straightforward. You go to Postman, and I'll give you demos and everything, but you go to Postman, and I don't know, the interface is just really nice. I don't have a whole lot to say about it. So we're going to see some examples with that of how to test your API, especially when we have post, put, and delete methods. And then what I was going to do Friday, what I mentioned last time, of showing you an example of an API that gets rid of that big else if statement. I'm going to show you that and transition into that today. And then Friday, I don't intend to prepare any materials. I'm finally going to put you on the spot and say, you have to ask me questions. Whenever I do a demo day like this, I always offer, ask me questions, put me on the spot, and, let me know what you're struggling with. We have homework 3 is in full swing now. If there's anything with homework 1 or homework 2 that you just didn't quite understand that you want to see me demo, at this point of the semester, I could even go over at least partial solutions. I don't want full solutions out there because then next semester someone's going to find the video and, but I can do partial solutions. I have no problem with that. But whatever you want to see on Friday, let me know. And if there's something specific that you do want to see, feel free to email me or how else do we? I would say Piazza Post, but it's possible I missed that. But email or Piazza Post and then email me the Piazza Post link. I don't know. Contact me somehow and let me know. Add me on Discord. DM me on Discord if you want. If there's something specific you want to see, or just tell me right now. And then I could prepare something if there's something specific. But I don't want to put together an examples lecture with a bunch of examples where you're all like, yeah, we know how to do that. So I want to know what's holding you up, especially if it's something holding you up on homework 3. Let me know and I can help you out on Friday. We can just turn that into a homework support lecture, or if there's anything else you want to see. It's whatever you all want. Or most likely as these things go, whatever the one of you who will speak up wants. So be the one who speaks up and get what you want. But today, testing APIs. Let's talk about this. Let me do a quick recap of a little bit of this RESTful API objective on the assignment. We have 5 different paths. They all are starting with /users, and we have different method types for the HTTP method, and 2 requests with the same method. One has an ID, and one doesn't. So you have to check, is there anything after users? You can look for a / and then something else here. If it doesn't have that, then it's a list request. If it does have a / and then something after the /, then it's a request for a specific user record. So we have 5 paths, all with the same, at least start to the path name. But the big thing here we want to talk about is, right from the first one, we have a post request. And we only know one way how to make post requests, I guess 2. We can either make an HTML form, enter the data into the form, and then submit the form. Or we can use JavaScript, make an AJAX request, fire off the AJAX request to the server. Both of those are a little bit tedious because they require building some infrastructure to make that request. Either you write in the HTML, write in the JavaScript. So let's see an easier way to do that. So I have a server. We'll go through quite a bit of this server. This is the one I want to use for the example. But I'm going to run this just for now. I have 2 paths, just the objective 4 paths running right now. Get all the users and post a user. So I'm running this on port 8000. If I go to 8000, content not found, I don't have anything hosted on my main page. I only have those 2 paths coded right now. So if I go to users, that's going to fire off a GET request for the users. And I'm going to get what I expect to get right now. I don't have my database hooked up because I want everything to be destroyed at every restart so we can start the examples fresh. But I have an empty list. No users were added. We didn't send any posts. So when we get to this point, how are we going to test our API? How are you going to test that, especially when you get to like the put and delete? You don't want to, you could write the HTML and have a big just testing page that you test everything. But instead, we're going to head over to Postman. This isn't strictly required for the course, but my goodness, if you're not using Postman or something to automate your requests, to send requests to your server, it's going to be extremely difficult to get those last two objectives with homework. So this is Postman. This is my recommended solution. This is pretty standard out there in industry. Postman is like the, let's say, the best solution for this. So to start with Postman, you do have to create an account. I created a brand new account for this example. And let's start making some requests using Postman. So I'm going to go to, and this is the site. Once you create an account and log in, this is the home page that you're going to see. I'm going to go to Start Something New. I'm going to create a new HTTP request. And you're going to get this interface, which this is the part where I got to here and I'm like, this is so self-explanatory. I don't need a whole lecture on this. You know, your 300 level computer science students, I'm sure you can figure out a drop-down menu and URL. So a drop-down menu is going to let me choose my HTTP method. I'm going to start with get. I'm going to choose my path, localhost 8000. I'm going to make a GET request for localhost 8000. Send. And when you first send this, it's going to give you an error. It's going to say, I can't do that. I can't access localhost. And you're going to have to download the Postman desktop API, the desktop client. Because from the browser, it's not going to be able to, like the web browser isn't going to be able to send a request to localhost. So if you download the desktop agent, I forget exactly what it's called, but I have it installed, it's running. Come on, get out of there. We should see it somewhere. Goodness, so much stuff running. Postman agent. So I have Postman running, the desktop version. If you don't have that running, Postman just gives you an error and says, click here to download. It's no big deal. But you got to download and install this thing so you can send requests to localhost, or else you can only send requests to anything that's out there live on the internet. So I clicked send, I sent this request, and I see the response. Same exact thing as when I went to the browser and just typed localhost 8000. I'm seeing the same thing, except I have all kinds of information. No headers available, of course. Of course, you don't give me more information. Don't do that to me. Oh, I actually did mess this up. I don't have any headers. I know exactly what I did. That's bad. I don't have my new lines in here. All right, new line, new line, new line, blank line. Should be good. I actually don't have any headers because they weren't formatted properly. All right, now let's send this. And now we have two headers. Hey, that was completely my fault. I was about to blame Postman for that. All right, 100% my fault on that one. All right, so now I have headers because the response was in the right format. And I can see all the information of this. I just have the minimal headers and the body of content not found. If we go to users, send this, I get nothing. My content type is application JSON now, and content length is 2. All right, so that we could do in the browser anyway, just by typing in the URL bar, so who cares? All right, let's get to the good stuff. I'm going to go to post. I'm sending a post request to the user's path. I'm going to go to the body, and I can start editing all this stuff. I can add headers if I want. Hidden headers, you could change. But what I'm interested here is body, and I want to send some raw JSON in the body. And now I can type whatever I want to send in the body of the post request, just manually typing in whatever the hell I want in whatever format that I want. If you want to do URL form encoded, it's going to do the encoding for you. Form data, which should be, where's my option? Which should be multi-part. But I just want to do raw JSON. because that's what the API is for the homework. So I'm going to add my things, email, example.com, I forgot my quote. And it's going to give me errors and stuff. It's going to look at this, and since I told it it's going to be JSON, it's going to check to make sure it's valid JSON. So I forgot my quotes there, and it's like, hey, this isn't valid JSON anymore. Username. I'll go with Hartloff. And you can even click this beautify button, which I like to do, which is going to format that to make it a little easier to read. So it gives you some tools that are going to help you just, I don't know, make things, just quality of life improvements. They're going to make things nice for you. And now I want to send this post request to /users with this in the body. I'm going to ship it, and I get a response. And here already I can see that my API is looking like the way I want to see it. I have the same information that I gave it, except I have an ID of 1. So a record was created, presumably. We'll check with a GET request. We can check the headers, but there's nothing too interesting there. And I can send another request, and I want to make sure that that ID is going to be 2 with the same information. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And just fire off post requests at my leisure, at my will right now. So that doesn't really guarantee everything. We got to go back to our GET requests. Let's get users with no body. And we should see a big old JSON array with all of our users in there. And yay, we do get that. Then we would do the same thing for our put requests. Put users / maybe I want to change user 4. I don't have this implemented in the server, so I'm not going to fire this off. Actually, I can still fire it off. It'll just do nothing. Maybe it'll break. And maybe I want to change this to email. It's not going to actually change again. Yeah, I don't get a response at all. Because the method that does that, I literally just have pass as the method. So this is how we can test our APIs. Go to Postman, create an account, download the desktop client, or the desktop agent, and then use this to fire off requests. And you can save requests. You can build scripts with this. You can do all kinds of automated testing and just all kinds of good testing. This is an incredible tool. And if this is your first time using it, this is the time for you to get practice using this and getting used to testing things using Postman. Any questions about that? Yes?
Just out of curiosity, what is the test on a tab? Is that something we can use to the right? Like bodies or yeah?
I don't know. To be honest, I haven't used this one. JavaScript to run after it's received. Oops. So if you want to, looks like it's to take the response and then run some JavaScript to do some automated testing with it. Basically writing like your unit tests. This is, at least for me, this is a lot like the Debugger, where it's an extremely powerful tool with all kinds of features, but even just using a small subset of those features is extremely useful. Like the Debugger, I like to use the Debugger just to step through my program and see all my variables, but the Debugger does so many more things. Like this is an example of one of those things. Like I just want to fire off my requests and see the responses, but there are so many more features here. It can take a whole career to untap all this potential, to actually really utilize it all. And I haven't gotten there yet, to be honest. I have no need to quite yet. Yeah.
Is there if there was one other thing you could tell us that would be good to use in the future about Postman, what would it be?
I would say I covered the most important stuff. Making these automated requests, or not automated, but making these requests without having to build an HTML front end is the important thing. I guess the one extra thing, I kind of briefly mentioned it, but saving your requests. So if I want to set a different request, maybe I want to send this as text and ship it. and then I want to go back to that one, I would go to my saved requests. I should be able to undo that. So I want to save this request, save this as save it as update record 4 or something like that. I have to create a collection. And saving all your requests. So then when you have requests of very different types, like if you're testing multiple different API endpoints, like we're testing all the users endpoints here, but if you want users endpoints and messages endpoints, you're going to be switching the body, that text here, very often to very different formats. So if you save your requests, now I go to like delete, get rid of all this, go to none, fire off the request and delete 4. Now I can go back to my saved. Oops, don't do that. Can you go back to it? Oh, it's embarrassing. Add? It seems so poorly named. And then load that up after we go away from that. So if you want to not keep typing in your JSON format or whatever, save those requests and save them for later. And then even have a full automated script, which is going to fire off a bunch of requests, would be the next step. Don't save. I don't want to overwrite my put. So that's how we're going to test our APIs. Super useful tool. All right, let's head over to Pycharm. We'll spend the rest of the time in Pycharm. Let me finally go over this thing. I've teased this quite a bit, but we're at a point where I can spoil everything that's in this server. So I have the first 2 paths, the Objective 4 paths, partially complete. I'm not using the database. I'm not going to show you that part. But I have the idea of the paths. So I'm going to spoil a decent amount. But I want to show you this server. So for those of you using Python, you have this handle method in your handler. And this is where you have a huge if, else if, or elif, else 404. That's most likely what you have. Maybe some of you found a way to get this built in a way. But I want to give an example of this finally to show you how you could organize things more. And now that your projects should be getting fired up and should be getting on their way, seeing the way that you build your projects using a framework, it's going to be more similar to this, where you're adding routes to a router and then having your server use that router to figure out which path to execute instead of having a big else if block. You're not going to have that when you're using a framework. The frameworks are all going to set up something like this. So I want to show you how you could set up your own for your homework. So I always recommend, but without examples, without kind of giving you an idea of how to set that up, might be a little hard to do. I don't know. So first off, this class, this is polymorph, or this is inheritance in Python. If you haven't seen it before, if you're wondering what this does, we're extending the base request handler class to create our own handler. So we have a whole class that we can work with, and we can do all the stuff that we can do with classes with that inheritance. So the thing I want to do is override the constructor and add new logic to the constructor, but without breaking my inheritance. So what I'm going to do is create a constructor. This is where I'm going to set up my router. That's specifically what I want to do. And then call the constructor from base request handler, because I'm overriding that constructor, but I still want all of the code in that constructor to be executed, because there's a lot of stuff that needs to happen in there. We got initialization that needs to be done. And it takes these 3 parameters. So I'm going to have a constructor that takes those 3 parameters and passes them as arguments to the other constructor. So I don't want to break anything while I'm doing this. So I'm preserving the super constructor. and then adding extra information to my constructor. So I'm going to create a router. We'll head over to the router class a bit, and then I'm going to call this add paths method. These are both, that's router class is something I wrote. The add paths method function technically here is something I wrote. So we'll look at both of those. We'll look at the full implementation. Those didn't come out of nowhere. We'll get to those for sure. And then when I get a request, I'm still printing the received data because I always like to just see the requests in the console. I'm going to create a new request. This is another class that I wrote based on the data that I received. Then I'm going to talk to my router and be like, handle this request. I'm going to pass a reference of this handler itself so I can call send all, so I can send data down the TCP socket. And that's my entire top level organization. That's it. That's all I need. That's all I have. Everything else is going to be handled by other modules and other classes. This is, for those of you in 404 or 442, we talk about this a lot, of having no piece of code, and arguably in 116 we do a bit, no one method or class or even module should be in charge of too much stuff. We want nice encapsulation. We usually call it the single responsibility principle, SRP, where every piece of code should be responsible for a single thing. So this piece of code is in charge of setting up the socket server, and then that's just about it. And then it passes off to the router to actually handle requests. This isn't handling requests, this is just setting up the server. That's all we want this to do. All right, so how are we actually getting requests handled? Let's go to requests first. I guess we'll just go chronologically here. My request class, hopefully you all have something similar to this, at least in functionality by now. The request class is going to take the request and do all of the parsing that we need. All the parsing that has to be done for every single request. So I'm going to define a few constants here, the things that we look for, new lines and that blank line. I'm going to initially get the request as bytes. I'm going to split it into its request line, the headers, and the body. And I'm not going to do anything with the body. I'm just going to set that to a field, because I don't want to parse the body, because at this point I have no idea what the body is. I have no idea how to handle it. I'm just going to pass that down the line and let somebody else parse the body. I'm not concerned about it in this class. So the body just goes along for the ride. But split request, I'm going to look for that new line, the very first new line. Everything before the first new line is the request line. Everything after that is just everything else. So I'm going to look for the first one and split the request, just grab the request line. I'm going to look for the first blank line, and I know that's my boundary between headers and body. So I'm going to split on that blank line, get the headers, get the body, and then return all three of those pieces of information. So I'm just looking for the first new line. That tells me that that's the end of the request line. I'm going to look for the first blank line. That tells me that's the end of the headers, and everything else is the body. So you should have this logic. I'm sure you all have this logic somewhere in your code. And then I'm going to write another method. I like to separate things. Everything's in charge of one thing. This method is just in charge of splitting the request into those three parts. This method is only in charge of parsing the request line, which honestly doesn't need too much logic here. Just split on spaces and return that. And then when I call it, I'm going to split that into its three values and set them into fields. And then parse headers, which I'm still surprised some of you aren't parsing your headers. Parse your headers. Write a method like this, please. I'm basically giving you the answer right here, especially if you're using Python. Parse your headers. I'm taking the raw headers. I'm splitting on the new line character. I'm splitting each line on a colon, and I'm throwing those in a dictionary. I've been talking about this all semester. This is like a 115 level problem if you're using nice encapsulation and breaking things apart into smaller methods. If this logic is somewhere buried in your receive method that's hundreds of and possibly even thousands of lines long at this point, then it gets a little harder because it's hard to wrap your brain around it. But once you break it into smaller methods like this, each one of these methods should be like, actually these are functions at this point. Each one of these functions should be like a 115, maybe a 116 level problem. But at this level in your career, the challenge is breaking things down into those smaller pieces. How do you actually design and architect your software? That's the big challenge. But if you have good architecture principles, the coding shouldn't be hard. I'm just returning that dictionary and putting that in another field of this class. And I have a little test. I didn't, I coded this pretty quick, so I didn't bother adding a full test suite, testing framework or anything. But I still wanted some testing, so I have a main method. I'm going to, might as well run this. I have a main method. I have a sample request. I'm going to call request. So the constructor, where am I? The constructor takes the bytes of the request. Why doesn't it like that? Did I spell it wrong? I don't know. But it's going to take the bytes of the request, create a request object, and I can look at my request object and make sure that it has everything that I expect it to have. Here's all my headers in a nice key value store. HTTP version, my method, my path, and the body should be an empty string. I skipped it. Or an empty byte array, because this is a GET request. So I want to have at least one test in there just to, for my own sanity's sake. This is a GET request that ends with that blank line, so there's no body to the request. Then I had this pass right here just to give myself a place for my breakpoint. Yeah?
Do you handle the semicolons?
No, so I'm not doing that in this code. So that would be the next thing. I can add that to my... Lost the mic. So it would be the next thing, like if I were expanding this, I would look for the semicolons here. Instead of just separating on the colon, I would split this by the semicolon. And at that point, the reason I didn't do it here is just because I was a little lazy. But I would need to create, what I would want to do is create a header class that had fields for all those pieces of information. I wouldn't be able to just easily slam it in a dictionary the way I'm doing it now. So I would create a header class and then do a little extra parsing to get the initial value before the first semicolon, and then the additional parameters, the additional, I don't know what the technical term is for them, the additional pieces of information in a list. But I'm not doing that here. That would be the next thing I would add to this code, though. So I get a request. I create a request object, and it has all the information that I need in fields in that object. Now, this is all in a separate file. I defined this class. I gave it all these helper methods, the helper functions and everything, define these constants, all that. So now, when I actually need to handle a request, I'm just deferring to that file. I'm saying, hey, give me a request object. Here's the request, the bytes of the request that I got. And it spits out a request object, and I don't have to clutter up my code in here. I don't have to have all that parsing code in this handle method doing all that crap. I have it all isolated here. Everything to do with requests goes here. If I want to do more parsing, like checking for them semicolons, I'm going to put it here. Everything goes here. And then elsewhere in my code, I never have to think about parsing a request, ever. If I'm thinking about parsing a request elsewhere in the code, that's an indicator to me that I'm violating my architecture, and I need to put that code in this file and keep it isolated, keep it separated from the rest of my code. Since response, I don't have much here for a response. This would be another thing that I would build up a little bit more, and I would add some more headers. I would add a way to add custom headers and things like that if I were expanding this. But I have one generate response method. Takes the bytes to send, takes the content type as a string, which I have a default value of plain text, and a response code with a default value of 200 OK. Generates the content length, takes the content type, and then sends everything. I could add more headers. I could add the no sniff and things like that. If I were doing homework 1, I would have to add my no sniff and things like that. But just a generic here, I need to send these bytes it's this content type with this response code to the user, and it's going to give me back the response in bytes. And you all have code that looks like this. You have to by now, or else you wouldn't have got through homework 1. Hopefully you have it generic like this. By now you have a function that does this instead of just manually creating each response every single time. If you have like this code cut and paste 18 times in your receive method, stop. Like that'll get you through a bit, but by the time you get to like homework 3, you're probably really feeling the pain of that right now. Your code is almost completely unmaintainable. Then by homework 4, it's just going to be even worse. Separate that into separate methods. All right, now let's get to the juicy stuff. Let's get to the router, because all that stuff you've done before. You might not have nice encapsulation and everything, but you have that code. Or hell, maybe you have better encapsulation than I do. Who am I to say? But let's talk about the router. I haven't seen anybody with a nice router yet, so let's talk about this one. So I'm going to import my request and response stuff. So since I have things in separate files, I do have to import it. I'm going to define the router class, which is going to have a list of routes, where a route is going to have a method, a path, and an action. If the method and path match for the request, I'm going to perform that action. Action is going to be a function, which is going to actually be how we're going to handle the request. I'm going to have 2 methods here. Is request match? It's going to check the method of a request. Is the method the same method that has to match exactly? And then for the path is going to have to match as a regular expression. This is important. We can't just do string matching if path equals path. We can't do that because we're going to have paths for different IDs. Or even in the homeworks 1 and 2, we're going to have paths for different images, requesting different images, different files. We just want to know if it matches our regular expression. And then when we add paths, we'll jump ahead a little bit. When we add paths, we're going to write these as regular expressions, where I have this regex /dot, which means there has to be a slash and then something after the slash. I don't care what that is, but there has to be something after the slash. So I'm going to use regex syntax here. And then when I add these to my router, I'm going to check. This is regex to say starts with. So I'm going to make sure that it starts with that path and matches the full regex of that path. So I'm not just doing string equality. I have to do a little bit of regex here because I can't hard code every single image. I can't hard code every single number for ID that you can have for a user. I'm not hard coding all of that. It's not going to happen. But I also want this code to be nice and generic. I don't want to have to set flags like this path is this and it's expecting an ID. I'll have a Boolean flag that says expects ID. Like I'm not doing any of that crap. I'm going to have this work on regex, and this code never has to change. Just when I add new paths, I'll just pull up my regex documentation, figure out which regex, because regex uses so many ridiculous symbols and I can never remember them. But pull up the regex documentation, figure out, okay, which path should match. If I get a GET request for users with a trailing slash and then at least 1 character after the slash, I'm going to handle that as getting a specific individual user. If I get a request for users with nothing else after it, I'm going to treat that as a list request. I want to get all of the users. So if the method matches and this regex is satisfied for the path, then we matched. Otherwise, false. And search results is a whole object. If you're wondering why I don't just say return search results, it's an object with truthiness. It's either none if there was no regex, or it's I forgot what, some information about the match, gives us all kinds of information. So if there's anything in there, it's going to return true, and if it's none, it's going to return false. The way I have it, so I can't just do return search results. And then finally, if a request ended up matching, I'm going to handle that request, which is just calling the action function on the request and the handler. So for example, 404, I don't need to know what the request was. I know it didn't match anything. And then the handler, so I can call send all. I'm going to use my generate response, content not found, it's text, plain text, and it needs to be a 404. And this is one nice thing, like my generate response, I only want to be worried about what I need to be worried about. This is the information that can change. Here's the content type, and here's the response code. Those are the things that I need to send. And I have my default values, so when I want to send an OK response, I just don't worry about this. I just don't add it. And I can, if I want to send plain text with a 200 OK, I just give it the bytes of what I want to send the user, and my method takes care of the rest. And I send it, ship it. Send it over to TCP second. I'm not super thrilled with the way I had that handled. I'd like to say handler.send and then send it the response and have it handle a little bit more, but I'm not going to nitpick. I would nitpick all day. So then I'll have my 404 route, which is going to be a route which I don't care about the method or the path, but if I'm handling a request with a 404, I want to call that 404 function. So this is a function down here that takes the argument types, the parameter types that I'm expecting for a handler, this request and the handler. So 404 matches that interface for handle request. And then I'm going to create a new route and just give it that function. Just pass that function as an argument. Now when we hit a 404, handle request, so that third argument action, handle request, we're going to call that action, which for a 404 will end up being this function, will end up being called with the request and handler. All right, now let's get to the router itself. I have an add route method, which is just going to append the route to the end of my routes, just so I'm not expecting anybody who uses this to actually access this list directly. I want them handling my list directly. I don't want that expectation. And then when I need to handle a request, this is the method that's called from our receive method in the top level of our server. When I want to handle a request, I'm going to iterate over my routes. If this is a request, if this request matches that route, handle it and exit this function. If we get to the end of this for loop without ever hitting the return, send them the 404. 404 handles it. Now we want to start using this router. So I created a new router that has an empty list. It's just going to return 404 for absolutely everything because there are no paths for this router. So I need to add things. Now I can add, let me not do that unless we're not going to have time to modify this. Maybe that's what we can do on Friday. Maybe I'll just expand this server live and you can say, now add multi-part, and then I can add that. Maybe that's what we'll do on Friday. But I'm going to call this add paths method, which is going to take a reference to my router. And then in this way, I can have all of my paths organized in a nice, clean, meaningful way. So I have this user paths. This is what, let me show the whole chain. Add paths comes from user paths. So user paths, add paths function is going to add all of the paths to my router that are related to the API in this homework. So what I would do is I would have like user paths, homework 1 paths, I don't know, image paths, chat paths, WebSocket paths. I would add all those paths in separate files and keep each piece of functionality of my server separated. We want that nice encapsulation. We don't want everything just jumbled together in one big file. You can do that. You can get away with it. Students have gotten all the way through this course with A's with one single file for their server. Yes, you can do it. Oh my goodness, don't put yourself through that torture though. Just spend a bit of time on design. One of Dr. Hertz's quotes in 442 is always 10 hours of debugging and programming is a good replacement for 1 hour of design. Just spend some time designing and you'll spend a lot less time programming. Like when I wrote this server, I spent, I don't know, an hour designing and half an hour writing code. Like this didn't take. It doesn't take too long if you have good design. Of course, I've designed. This is like the 20th server that I've written like this. So, I already know the design coming in. I already have it in my head what I want to build. So the design work didn't take too long. But like any of the code, like the regex is a little tricky. But like if I showed you any code that's like, whoa, what is that? Like I showed you any code that's complex. If you have good design, that's how your code's going to look. Nothing's going to look too crazy. All right, so let's get on with it. We add these routes. Like I said, 3 of these are not implemented at all. But I'm going to add the post, the regex for my path, and then the function that's going to be called to handle that request. For create, each one of these is going to be a function that takes the request itself and a handler for that request, which the handler is just so we can send all at the end. Each time I see this, I'm like, why did I design it like that? These should return responses. I think that's the way I would want it. And then actually have response be a full class. Build out response a bit more. Have this return a response and not have to pass this handler in every function call. Just give it the request. I'm just going to do, most of this logic is just so I can increment the ID. Reading the body, like there's just not much to do. I already have the body in the request. It's bytes, but if I hit this path, I know it's going to be encoded with UTF-8, so I'm going to decode it. I know it's JSON formatted. And here's where I would normally, like for a production app, I would do all kinds of checks. I would make sure that everything is in the right format. Here, I'm just going to assume it's right and call these. You can safely do that on your homework assignments. But we should have a lot of validation and error handling here. But I'm going to assume that it's a string, UTF-8 string that's JSON encoded. Load it as JSON. And again, if you're using something other than JavaScript or Python, something that doesn't have a nice like JSON.load, JSON.stringify or whatever, you can pull in an external library for JSON. So those using, I don't know if Go has internal JSON support, but if it doesn't, you can pull in something in. Java and Scala, I know there are a few students using those. You can pull in JSON libraries. Those are allowed because that just wouldn't be fair. In Python, I just import JSON, import JSON and JSON.load.s, and I don't have to do any work. It should be that easy in every language if it's that easy in some languages. I don't want you to get hung up on JSON. Then I'm going to increment my ID, which I just have as a variable up here because I'm cheesing the database side of things. For your homework, you obviously have to add the database. This doesn't persist on restarts. But I'm going to increment that last ID, add to that dictionary the ID, and respond with that dictionary with the 201 created. And then for lists, it's even easier. I'm just going to grab all of my records with the database. This will have to be like a select star from or find all in Mongo. Excuse me. I'm just using a list, so I'm just going to grab it, encode it as a string, and then encode it as bytes. Send it with the 200. Oh, I don't even need this. I got my default parameter. And then I would have to build out the other ones. I'm not going to give away everything. Build out the rest of the functionality. That's database. I don't have anything interesting in there. Yeah, that's the whole thing. That's the setup. So this is a solution. Obviously, there are plenty of ways to get this done. But this is a solution. This is a way you can build a router and get rid of that big else if. Get rid of that whole thing. Any questions on that? I don't know if that went too fast, too slow, or anything. Anybody have questions? We have a few minutes. If you want to see something, see part of that again. Anything didn't really make sense? I forgot to pull up my phone today. If there's something in Discord. Anything not quite make sense or anything? Yeah.
Well, I'm just wondering,
Nobody said anything anymore?
for breaking down the logic of like the different classes and whatnot? Did you do that beforehand, or like, is it like a convention you're using, or is it just, you're just trying to break down everything and make sure it's simple? Like, how did you come to like having all these different, you know?
I just broke it into the way that made sense to me. I mean, when I wrote this one, I'm just like, I've done it so many times by now. I know I want a request class, a response should be a class, but I just had everything to do with responses, everything to do with requests, parsing, response constructing, and definitely something for router, which is just going to handle routing. It doesn't have any logic at all. Maybe that's the wrong word to use, except the 404. But it doesn't actually do anything, but I want something that handles all the routing. Now when I'm actually adding functionality to this, I don't have to think about request parsing. I don't have to think about building responses. I don't have to think about routing. All of that stuff's done somewhere else. And now when it's time to actually add functionality to this thing, I'm just adding the functionality. If I get a post request for users, call this function. So anything, when I'm sitting down to write the actual functionality, if there's something that I'm doing for each one that has nothing to do with the functionality itself, that tells me that I want another file, I want another class, or some more outside helper methods or something. Something where I don't have to do that. Because here, I just want to focus. Post request, okay, I can't get rid of that. Like, I have to specify the request type that I'm going to receive. The path, okay, I can't get rid of that. For each piece of functionality, each endpoint I add, I have to specify the path. What actually is done when we get a request of that type for that path, I can't get rid of that either. Like, what is this actually going to do? And then anything, like if I'm spending too much time building my responses, okay, that tells me I want a method, a function for that elsewhere. Put that somewhere else and get all that out of there. And the rest of this is all logic. What happens when I get a post request for the user's path? Everything else has to do with that. So I'm feeling good about this. If there's something that is not related to that specific endpoint, then I want to write more code and parse, file that out. General rule of thumb that I like to follow is if I have duplicate code, if I have to write the same code twice, I'm factoring that out and putting it in another file or finding the file that it belongs in. If it's related to one of these things, I'm going to put it in that file. If it's not related to any of those and it's duplicate code, creating a new file. So that's my thought process, like when I'm writing a new app. Duplicate code, I'm going to want another module, put that code over there, and then import it. But again, for these servers, I've written so many of these that I'm just like, yep, I know request, response, database, the router. I know exactly what I'm going to do here. And then the stuff that's left for you for the assignment, extracting the ID from the path. So when you get a request, you have request.path. It's already been parsed. Everything's right there. So you would take that path and then look for the ID. That's a little specific to the user paths. So I'm going to put this function in the user paths file. When we get a request to retrieve a specific user, call extract ID, pull that user, return it, update, pull the ID, find that record, update it, delete, find the ID, call that ID method, and delete that record. And then hooking it all up to a database, of course. And I would separate the database. I would keep the database separate from the logic. I always like to, I don't know if that's really required, but I always like abstracting out the functionality of the database. One big reason for that is for testing. If you have all your database code right in this function, you're not testing this without firing up your database. You can't do it. If you have your database, everything to do with your database separate, especially if you have it hidden behind an interface, now you can implement a mock database that implements the same interface that doesn't use an actual database, and now you can actually meaningfully test things. I'd never like mixing my database code into any of my logic of my program for that specific reason. Sometimes I want to test without a database, like I'm doing right now. I would abstract this through an interface, have a database interface, and then have one implementation of it that actually uses my database and one implementation that does this. And whenever I need to access or do anything with these two values, I would add that as an interface method and then work through the interface in all of this code. Then I can test without spinning up my database, and when it's time for production, I'm going to spin up my database, do some extra tests, of course, making sure I did everything there right, and then go to production with the database running. I realize we're 2 minutes over. All right, so Friday, if you have any questions, like I'll open it up, and you can ask whatever you want on Friday. My intent is to not prepare anything, so if I do go with that, make sure you do have some questions if you want to see anything. But with that, see everyone Friday.